Good evening,
Good
Mr.
evening.
de Varennes.
Good morning for me.
Նախ շնորհակալություն ենք հայտնում ձեզ, պարոն Ֆերնան դե Վարեն, մեր առաջարկը ընդունելու համար, հարցազրույց տալու։ Մենք ներկայացնում ենք Հայաստանում գործող իրավապաշտպան կազմակերպություններից մեկը, Մարդու իրավունքների եզդիական կենտրոն իրավապաշտպան կազմակերպությունը, այդ կազմակերպության Xirat լրատվական հարթակը, որը Հայաստանում ապրող ամենամեծ ազգային փոքրամասնության եզիների կյանքի եւ մշակույթի մասին պատմող մեդիա հարթակ է։ Ես հանդիսանում եմ Xirat լրատվականի գլխավոր խմբագիրը, իմ անունը Մուրադ Շամոյան է, ինձ թարգմանելու հարցում կօգնի իմ գործընկեր Մաշան Մանուկյան։ Եվս մեկ անգամ շնորհակալություն ենք հայտնում ձեզ մեր հարցազրույցի առաջարկը ընդունելու համար։
Thank you, Mr. Varennes, for accepting our request for the interview. We present the Xirat Media platform of Yazidi Center for Human Rights NGO, which is the media platform for the biggest national minorities of Armenia, covering the Yazidis' life and culture as well as the human rights of national minorities. The interview will take Murad Shamoyan, the editor of Xirat Media platform, and I am project assistant Masha Manukyan. I will help him to translate our interview.
Պարոն Վարեն, նախ առաջին հարցը կխնդրենք, որ մի փոքր ներկայացնենք, թե ինչ է Իրանից ներկայացնում հակամարտությունների կանխարգելում ու փոքրամասնությունների իրավունքների պաշտպանություն եվրոպական տարածաշրջանային ֆորումը, որը տեղի ունենալու հոկտեմբերի 12-13-ին, եւ ինչ խնդիր կլուծի այս ֆորումի կազմակերպում ազգային փոքրամասնությունների համար։
At the first, we would like you to introduce a little bit the European Regional Forum on conflict prevention and the protection of the human rights of minorities, which is the main purpose of the forum, and what kind of issues will be solved while organizing this forum.
Thank you very much, and especially thank you for having me participating in this interview and in your work also. It's very important that we defend the rights of Yazidis everywhere around the world, including in Armenia and other countries. Rather in my case, as Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues of the United Nations, as an independent expert, I concluded a number of years ago that we needed to have events that were on a regional basis in different parts of the world in order to be able to reach minorities more directly, to be closer to the kind of situations and specific contexts experienced by minorities around the world. And so that's why we decided a number of years ago to have these regional meetings, these regional forums on different themes that would change from year to year. This way, minorities could participate in different parts of the world much more directly and interact with me as Special Rapporteur, but also bring issues that were important for minorities in different parts of the world to the attention of my mandate with the United Nations. So on the 12th and the 13th of October, so in about 3 or 4 weeks, we are having the European Regional Forum. And we are hoping to have 200 or 300, perhaps even more participants from different parts of Europe, and Europe, not only Western or Central Europe, but also Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We include, for example, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, in terms of this European Regional Forum. The theme is conflict prevention and the protection of the human rights of minorities. And the reason we've chosen that theme is to highlight the extent that most conflicts around the world today, and by conflicts we mean violent conflicts, wars essentially. Most of these conflicts today are inside a country, and most of these conflicts inside a country involve minorities. Minorities that maybe are wanting to separate, to secede from the country in which they find themselves, or in some cases minorities that ask for autonomy or that ask for their rights to be respected. What we are seeing, because we've already had 3 regional forums in different parts of the world, Africa and the Middle East, the Americas, and Asia Pacific. What we're seeing is that it seems that in most violent conflicts around the world where you have minorities involved, it seems that most of these conflicts came about because of the perception that the rights of minorities were not being respected. So the typical scenario is that there are long-standing grievances, claims that minorities are excluded or in fact disadvantaged or discriminated in areas such as, well, political participation, or areas such as education, or even in terms of the extent minorities can actually be involved in terms of economic activities of the state and certain areas of employment. So the importance and one of the objectives of these regional forums was to try to understand why are these conflicts happening involving minorities in different parts of the world and what can be done. And already it's very clear that quite often, if the human rights of these minority groups had been respected, that most of these conflicts probably would not have happened. So it's a process of trying to understand conflicts in different parts of the world, why they happened, and what kind of solution we could have to try to prevent them.
Շնորհակալություն, պարոն Վարեն։ Հաճախ որպես կոնֆլիկտների առաջացման պատճառներ նշվում են փոքրամասնությունների ոչ բավարար մասնակցությունը հանրային հասարակական քաղաքական կյանքին։ Մեզ հետաքրքիր է ինչ է կարծում փոքրամասնությունների ներառականության ապահովման գործում ինչ դեր ունեն հասարակական կազմակերպությունները, որքանով են նմանատիպ ֆորումները նպաստում, որպեսզի այդ խնդիրները լուծվեն, ու իդեմս նաև հենց այս եվրոպական տարածաշրջանային ֆորումի։
Sometimes the main reason for the conflict becomes the non-effective participation of national minorities in public life, in political life, etc. What do you think? What kind of role the NGOs have in ensuring the inclusion of minorities, and how much do such forums contribute to solving these problems?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. I think the answer is that civil society organizations, NGOs, play a fundamental role in that they will highlight, they will identify areas where the human rights are not respected, including the human rights of minorities. So this raising of the visibility of how and where the human rights of minorities are not respected is essential. That's the way that we can try to prevent conflicts. If we can see, if we can identify where minorities are excluded, where minorities are victims of discrimination, and very honestly, this kind of work, this type of identification of where and when human rights are not respected is usually done most effectively by NGOs, by civil society organizations. And so I think they have a primary role. They are at the front line, as a matter of fact, of the type of awareness raising, the type of identification that needs to be done to try to protect the human rights of minorities in order to prevent conflicts.
Thank you very much.
Մենք նկատում ենք, որ հիմա ժամանակակից աշխարհում մի այսպիսի տենդենց կա, որ փոքրամասնությունների կողմից ազգային փոքրամասնությունների կողմից իրենց իրավունքների պաշտպանության նկատմամբ, այսինքն կա հետաքրքրության բացակայություն, ու հաճախ ազգային փոքրամասնությունները հետաքրքրված չեն կամ քիչ են հետաքրքրված նմանատիպ ֆորումներում, հարթակներում իրենց խնդիրները բարձրաձայնել, կամ շատ հաճախ վախենում են, որ իրենց մասին խնդիրները բարձրաձայնելուց հետո կարող են որոշակի հետապնդումների ենթարկվել պետությունների կողմից։ Մեզ հետաքրքիր է ձեր կարծիքը, որն է պետությունների դերը ազգային փոքրամասնություններին իրենց իրավունքների պաշտպանության մեջ ընդգրկելու գործում, ինչ պարտականություններ ունի պետությունը այս համատեքստում։
In the modern world, there is a tendency for minorities to be less interested in defending their rights. Often they are either not interested in raising their issues on such platforms or are afraid that they may be persecuted by the state. We would like to know your opinion. What is the role of the state in involving national minorities in the protection of their rights?
Well, all states are supposed to be the primary defenders of everyone's human rights. This has to be understood. The first obligations to protect the human rights within the state is the government itself, is the state apparatus, if you will. And therefore, it's extremely important, for example, at the United Nations, to try to engage in positive dialogue with different governments to remind them of their primary obligations to make sure that everyone's human rights are respected. It's not easy. We all know this. Of course, some governments disagree with the international understanding of some human rights. Certain governments find human rights rather onerous, a burden rather, and they don't like being reminded of their obligations. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that governments understand what their obligations are, that it's to everyone's benefit that these human rights be respected, and that the government should collaborate with civil society and the United Nations and other institutions such as the Council of Europe to make sure that those human rights are understood and that there are effective mechanisms to try to have them respected. Now, there's another aspect, if I understood the question correctly. It can be very discouraging for individuals to try to have their human rights respected in some countries. There may be situations, there may be countries where individuals feel threatened, where they will feel vulnerable, and they might feel that they would be at risk if they try to defend human rights in a very visible way. My answer to that is that they're right. It is sometimes extremely difficult to actually expose yourself, in fact, perhaps to repercussions. You try to defend human rights, yours or the human rights of others. But at the end of the day, unless we're willing to actually advance those human rights, we will not be able to improve, to change society as it must be. So it's a difficult struggle, but it's a struggle that is needed if we really want to try to ensure that the human rights of everyone are respected, whether they're women, minorities, Roma, or other different groups around the world.
Պարոն Վարեն, կուզենք որ դուք նշեք ինչ հիմնական բացեր ու մարտահրավերներ եք դուք տեսնում կոնֆլիկտների հաղթահարման ու այդ համատեքստում նաև ազգային փոքրամասնությունների իրավունքների արդյունավետ իրացման տեսանկյունից ինչ բացեր ու մարտահրավերներ կառանձնացնեիք.
Our next question is what are the main gaps and challenges you see in the terms of overcoming conflicts and effectively exercising the rights of national minorities in that context?
Thank you very much. I think, and this may sound surprising, one of the main gaps in terms of conflict prevention is the understanding that the denial of the human rights of minorities is one of the main causes of conflicts, and probably one of the most effective ways to prevent violent armed conflicts is to ensure from the beginning that the human rights of minorities are well understood and well respected. It's a gap. There's something missing because what I just presented to you is actually not well understood at the United Nations. Surprisingly enough, most of the activities in conflict prevention at the United Nations is not done from a human rights perspective. And I think this is a flaw. This is an omission. There have been reports that quite clearly talk about long-standing grievances of exclusion and discrimination as one of the leading causes of conflicts. but that analysis is actually not fully practiced at the United Nations. The conflict prevention tools that the United Nations has, its various programs, are led from New York, whereas the main human rights activities of the United Nations are done in Geneva, two different sections. And unfortunately, the human rights section and the conflict prevention section of the United Nations are separate, and they're not integrated sufficiently. So there seems to be, I would suggest, and this is my own view, my own analysis as a UN independent expert, my own view is that the conflict prevention approaches of the United Nations is too much disconnected from the human rights approach, which is essential in order to prevent most conflicts today, because most conflicts today are internal, inside a country, and most of these conflicts involve minorities that have long-standing grievances that their human rights are not respected and that they are excluded and in fact victims of discrimination by the government and the state itself.
Thank you very much.
Շնորհակալություն, պարոն Վարեն, կա մի հայտնի ճշմարտություն, հա, որ ավելի հեշտ ու ավելի լավ է կանխարգելել կոնֆլիկտները, քան post factum գնահատել դրանց պատճառներն ու ազդեցությունը։ Ըստ ձեզ կոնֆլիկտների կանխարգելման գործում այ որ օղակին է պատկանում ամենաշատ բաց թողումները, ու որտեղ պետք է փնտրել խնդիրների արմատները։
It is well known truth that it is easier or better to prevent conflicts than to assess their causes and effects. In your opinion, in the field of conflict prevention, which stakeholders have the most responsibility to solve the problems and where to look for the roots of the problem?
Thank you. I actually think the main responsibility, well, once again, it should fall onto the government. Obviously, the government is the primary defender, or is supposed to be under international law, the primary defender, has the main obligation to ensure that human rights violations do not occur. However, in most situations of conflict, the government of a state is actually one of the armed sides. That's one of the parties involved in the violence, in the conflict. So you have here a situation which is a little bit awkward. It's unusual because the party, the side which is supposed to have the main responsibility for the protection of human rights, the state, is also one of those involved in the violence, in the war, in the conflict. So therefore, I would suggest that it becomes extremely important for the United Nations, for the international community, to try to actually play a role to assist in the prevention of conflicts as much as possible, or once a conflict has started, to try to help the process for the ending of the violent conflict. Civil society also has a role, because quite often civil society is one perhaps of the more balanced voices. They can see that there are issues of human rights that are involved and raise them and try to defend or to address the root causes of most conflicts, which is denial of human rights of minorities. But so to summarize what I just said, I think because of the special nature of violent conflicts, that it is extremely important for organizations such as the United Nations, in the context of Europe, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe, to take leadership roles in preventing conflicts. Now, I'll add just one element to emphasize the connection between conflict prevention and minorities. You may know that the OSCE has a special actually tool, a measure. There is a position called the High Commissioner on National Minorities, the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. His function is actually conflict prevention within the OSCE. And people forget that what he is supposed to do is to provide a way to solve many of the violent conflicts in Europe, or to prevent them. And his role is there to prevent them through the protection, actually, of minorities, of national minorities in the European context. That's a reminder of the connection between conflicts and minorities, which the OSCE has recognized, but which perhaps is not always understood. What's the best way to prevent conflicts? Is to try to address the grievances of exclusion and discrimination that could lead to violent opposition by some minorities.
Thank you very much.
Մենք գիտենք, որ կոնֆլիկտները բազմաթիվ բացասական ազդեցություններ են ունենում ու երկար ժամանակ նաև հետք են թողնում հասարակությունների վրա, հասարակական կյանքի վրա ու հաճախ կոնֆլիկտների ազդեցությունները կարծրատիպերի ու կլիշեների ձևով մնում են հասարակության մեջ, մի քանի սերունդ կարող են մնալ անգամ։ Կուզեի երիտասարդների դերի մասին այս համատեքստում խոսել, այ որն է երիտասարդների դերը ձեր կարծիքով կոնֆլիկտների կանխարգելման եւ խաղաղարարության գործում, խաղաղության հաստատման գործում ու դուք ինչ եք կարծում ազգային փոքրամասնության երիտասարդները Եվրոպայում ու մնացած տարածաշրջաններում լիարժեք իրացնում են իրենց վերապահված դերը, միտված կոնֆլիկտների կանխարգելման ու խաղաղության հաստատմանը։
And this is our last question. Conflicts have many negative effects and that leave their mark on society for a long time. And often their effects remain in the form of stereotypes and cliché for generations. What do you think? What is the role of young people in conflict prevention and peace building? What do you think? Are national minority youth in Europe or in other territory now fulfilling their role in conflict prevention and peacekeeping?
There's a lot in that question. Let me answer in this way. I think it's extremely difficult to get rid of stereotypes and prejudices after you've had a conflict, a violent conflict. That's why prevention is so important. You want to avoid violence, a war, as much as possible. How do you redress that after a conflict? It's extremely difficult, once again. But what has to be done is that within the states, and even a country where there's no conflict, this should be done. Diversity, the presence of minorities or people who are different because of their religion or language or color of their skin. All of these people should be celebrated, should be identified in campaigns by the government also. Government should have campaigns to celebrate this diversity within the country, to try to get rid of stereotypes, the negative stereotypes against certain minorities or certain groups. And that, in other words, there has to be the portrayal campaigns by the government that are positive, that actually try to get rid of the negative stereotypes that certain communities may be tagged with. And governments, I would suggest, have a responsibility to actually offer positive images of all the different components of the country, all the different groups, and to celebrate the different religions, the different ethnic groups, the different languages, as something that makes the country more diverse, but richer because of this diversity. And that kind of positive promotion of differences inside a country, it's not something that all governments do. In fact, I don't think there are that many governments who really do this in a sufficiently strong national way. Certainly not very effectively. Some governments do, and Canada, I think, is a positive example. In Canada, multiculturalism is considered a constitutional value. It's in the Constitution that we need to celebrate all of our differences. That's the kind of approach that is needed, and governments have a primary obligation in relation to that. But also NGOs and international organizations have to encourage this kind of positive and inclusive approach. Not only tolerant. Tolerance is not an entirely positive word, by the way. Tolerance is needed, yes, but you need inclusiveness, being willing to accept and celebrate and embrace our differences. And that's an extremely important value which needs to be done if we want to break down negative stereotypes.
Thank you very much. And also thank you for answering the questions and for organizing the upcoming forum. And we wish you an effective and participatory forum.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Շնորհակալ ենք ձեզ արդյունավետ աշխատանք. Thank you very much for answers and for participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Good luck, Mr. Varennes.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.